The Powder River Basin, Wyoming Territory, August 1883. The sun was a hammer on the anvil of the high plains, but the wind, even now, carried a prophecy of winter. It was a dry, ceaseless wind that scoured the land, stole the moisture from a man's lips, and whispered of a cold so profound it could crack stone and stop a heart. It was this wind that most settlers fought, building their cabins of lodgepole pine, chinking the gaps with mud and moss, stacking their cordwood high against the coming siege. Klaus Richter, however, was not building up. He was digging down. Where his neighbors' cabins rose proudly from the prairie grass, seeking the sun, Klaus's home site was a wound in the earth. For 3 weeks, with a stubbornness that bordered on madness in the eyes of the community, he had been excavating a massive rectangle, 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. His shoulders, broad from a life of stonework in the old country, strained against the shovelfuls of dense, clay-rich soil. He wasn't leveling a foundation. He was sinking his entire world 4 feet below the surface of the earth. Thomas Miller, the man who had built nearly half the structures in their small settlement, reined in his horse at the edge of the pit. Miller was a practical man, a carpenter whose reputation was as solid as the dovetailed corners on his cabins. He understood wood, wind, and weight. He did not understand this. He squinted, his face a mask of genuine confusion. "What in God's name are you building, Richter?" Miller's voice was not unkind, but it carried the full weight of his authority. "A grave for your whole family?" Klaus paused, leaning on his shovel. He wiped a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. He was a man of few words, his English still thick with a Bavarian accent. He looked at the hole, then at the vast, empty sky. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not a grave. A shelter." Miller shook his head, a slow, pitying gesture. "A shelter from what? The sky? You're inviting the damp and the frost right into your bones. This is foolish, Klaus. Everything I know about building in this country tells me this is a mistake." But Klaus Richter wasn't building from what Miller knew. He was building from a knowledge that ran deeper, a memory of stone cellars in his homeland that held the cool of the earth through the hottest summer and stayed above freezing in the cruelest winter. He was building something that didn't fight the Wyoming wind, but hid from it. And when the great blizzards of 1884 swept down from the north, a winter that would be spoken of for a generation, this foolish, grave-like hole in the ground would prove to be the warmest, safest place for 100 miles. The difference between life and death would be measured in 4 feet of soil. If you're fascinated by the forgotten wisdom of frontier builders, subscribe to our channel. We explore one of these incredible techniques every week, uncovering the physics behind the folklore. Join us and discover how the harshest environments inspired the most brilliant innovations. The mockery, like the Wyoming wind, started as a whisper and grew into a steady, chilling force. Klaus Richter's project became a local curiosity, then a running joke. He was an outsider, a German immigrant whose quiet nature was easily mistaken for simple-mindedness. He and his wife, Anke, had arrived 2 years prior, bringing with them little more than a set of stonemason's tools, 2 young children, and a fund of knowledge that simply had no precedent on the American frontier. In Bavaria, Klaus's father and grandfather had not been cabin builders. They were masters of the cellar, the deep stone-lined cellars beneath homes and breweries. They understood that the earth was not a dead thing. It was a vast thermal battery. It breathed a slow, steady breath, exhaling coolness in the summer and a gentle residual warmth in the winter. While others saw dirt, Klaus saw insulation. While others saw the ground as a source of cold to be overcome, Klaus saw it as a massive, stable reservoir of heat, a silent ally against the brutal air. This understanding was utterly alien to men like Thomas Miller. Miller's experience was built on a different set of truths, learned over 20 years of raising structures on the plains. "Moisture, Klaus," he argued, stopping by the site again a week later, his tone shifting from bewilderment to urgent warning. "The ground sweats. Come spring, you'll have water seeping through those walls. Your floor joists will rot in 2 years. Your blankets will be damp forever. And when the deep frost comes, it'll heave the ground and crack your foundation from below. You're building a trap." Miller's logic was sound, based on everything he had ever seen. A shallow cellar was a damp, miserable place. What he couldn't comprehend was the difference between a shallow cellar and a deep, properly constructed subterranean living space. He saw a hole, Klaus saw a harbor. The social pressure began to mount. At the general store in the nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings that served the scattered homesteads, the talk was merciless. It was Jebediah "Jeb" Stone, a farmer known for his loud laugh and blunt opinions, who gave the structure its name. "Heard Klaus Richter's still digging," Jeb boomed to the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove. "Figured out what he's building yet?" He paused for effect, a grin spreading across his face. "It's a root cellar. Hopes to grow a family of potatoes down there, I reckon." The name stuck. Richter's Root Cellar. It was cruel in its dismissal, painting Klaus not as an innovator, but as a man who didn't know the difference between a house and a hole for storing vegetables. The laughter that followed Jeb's pronouncement sealed the community's judgment. Klaus Richter was a fool, and his family would pay the price for his foolishness come winter. Even officialdom registered its disapproval. Mr. Abernathy, the land agent from the county seat, made a special trip out to the Richter homestead. He was a man who lived by ledgers and regulations, his suit and tie a stark contrast to the buckskin and denim of the homesteaders. He stood at the edge of the now stone-lined pit, a ledger under his arm, his face a study in bureaucratic concern. "Mr. Richter," he began, his tone formal and clipped, "I am obligated to inspect new constructions to ensure they meet territorial standards for safety and permanence. This method is highly unorthodox. It's not in any approved manual I've seen. I cannot, in good conscience, endorse such a structure. Should it fail, the territory government will bear no responsibility." It was a veiled threat, a warning that if disaster struck, the Richters were on their own. But the cruelest cut came not from a stranger or an official, but from family. Anka's brother, Marcus Vogel, came to visit, his face etched with a deep, pitying concern that felt worse than open mockery. He took his sister aside while Klaus worked, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Anka, this isn't right," he pleaded. "Look at it. It looks like he's afraid of the sky. People are talking. They're calling your home a coffin. It makes you look like you're married to a fool. How can you raise Elias and Lena in a hole in the ground?" That evening, the weight of it all finally pressed down on Anki. The laughter from the store, the condescension from the land agent, the pity in her own brother's eyes. It was too much to bear in silence. The cabin walls, still just a stone foundation in a pit, felt confining. "It is hard to be the town story, Klaus," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The setting sun cast long shadows into their temporary shelter, a crude lean-to near the construction site. Her son, Elias, was trying to mimic his father, carving a piece of scrap wood with a small knife, while little Lena slept on a cot. Klaus stopped his work, laying down a trowel heavy with mortar. He came and sat beside her, his large, calloused hands gently taking hers. He didn't offer excuses or apologies. He offered his core conviction. "The wind can steal what it can touch," he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It steals the heat from the logs. It steals the breath from your lungs. I build where the wind cannot reach." He looked over at his children, his expression softening. I do not do this for Thomas Miller's approval or for your brother's comfort. I do this for Elias and for Lena, so they will not know the deep cold. Anki looked at her husband's face, at the certainty etched there, a certainty that wasn't born of arrogance, but of a deep, inherited understanding. Her faith in him, momentarily shaken by the storm of public opinion, solidified. She squeezed his hand. Winter will tell us what's wise and what's foolish, she declared, her voice now firm. It was a statement of faith, a drawing of a line in the sand. Their family against the world, with the coming winter as the final, impartial judge. Klaus wasn't merely digging a hole and lining it with rock. His process was a masterclass in forgotten engineering, a slow and deliberate conversation with the earth. The mockery of his neighbors was born from an ignorance of his methods. They saw a simple pit. He was building a complex, integrated system designed to manage moisture, stabilize temperature, and defy the wind. First was the foundation, which went deeper than the main floor. He dug a trench another 2 feet down, below the frost line, and laid a footing of massive flat stones. This ensured that the ground beneath his home would never freeze and heave, preventing the very cracking that Thomas Miller had predicted. Upon this footing, he began to build his subterranean walls. These were not the rough, loosely stacked stones of a farmer's field wall. This was the work of a true mason. He used granite field stones chosen for their density and ability to hold temperature. Each stone was selected, shaped with a hammer and chisel, and fitted with painstaking precision. The gaps were minimal, filled not with simple mud, but with a carefully prepared mortar of clay, lime, and sand. This mortar was more than a binder. It was a barrier against moisture. He built the stone walls up to the 4-foot mark, perfectly flush with the surrounding prairie. This stone wall was his thermal battery. All summer long, it would soak up the coolness of the deep earth. Miller's second concern, moisture, was addressed with equal care. Before laying the floor joists, Klaus spread a 6-inch layer of coarse gravel across the entire floor of the excavation. This created a capillary break, a space where ground moisture could collect and drain away without ever touching the wooden structure of the house. The floor itself was then built on thick log sleepers, raising it a full foot off the gravel bed, creating a dead air space that provided yet another layer of insulation and a final, definitive barrier against the damp. Anyone stepping into the finished cabin would be walking on a wooden floor as dry as any in the territory. Only when this subterranean fortress was complete did he begin to build with wood. The log walls rose from the stone foundation, but they were only 4 feet high. This was the genius of the design's economy. He needed less than half the timber of a conventional cabin, a significant saving in both labor and material. These short walls presented a minimal profile to the relentless Wyoming wind. Where Miller's 8-foot walls were a sail, catching the full force of every gale, Klaus's home barely rose above the sagebrush. The wind would shear over it, unable to find purchase, unable to press its icy fingers into the chinking and steal the precious heat from within. The roof was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a shallow, pitched timber frame, strong and well-braced, but its real magic lay in what covered it. Klaus laid down a thick layer of sod, cut directly from the prairie. The grass was still alive. This living roof was heavy, providing immense stability, and it was a spectacular insulator. In the summer, the moisture in the sod would evaporate, actively cooling the house. In the winter, the thick mat of roots and soil, covered by a blanket of snow, would provide an insulating value that no simple shingle or plank roof could ever match. The physics were simple, yet profound. A conventional cabin in a Wyoming winter was an isolated box, fighting to maintain a 100-degree temperature differential with the outside world. If it was 65 degrees Fahrenheit inside and minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit outside, every square inch of the walls, roof, and floor was a battlefield where heat was desperately trying to escape into a universe of cold. Klaus Richter's home was different. 3/4 of its exterior surface wasn't touching the minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit air. It was touching the earth, and the earth, 4 feet down, was not minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a stable, predictable 50 degrees Fahrenheit. His home wasn't fighting a 100-degree battle. It was fighting a 15-degree battle. The earth was doing almost all of the work. This was the reframing insight that no one else could see. They saw him burying his house in the source of the cold. He knew he was anchoring it to an eternal source of warmth. The ground was not his enemy. The ground was his shield, his blanket, his greatest ally. His neighbors were trying to keep the cold out. Klaus Richter was focused on keeping his warmth in. And by wrapping his home in the steady embrace of the planet itself, he had created a shelter of almost impossible efficiency. The cost was not in dollars, but in sweat. He had moved tons of earth and rock by hand, but his savings were immense. Half the logs, half the chinking, and, as winter would prove, a fraction of the firewood. He had built a home that was not just a structure, but a living part of the landscape, as resilient and enduring as the land itself. The first snows came in November, a gentle dusting that was a prelude, not the performance. December brought a deeper cold, the kind that firmed the ground and made the air sharp in the lungs. The settlers hunkered down, their wood piles already shrinking. Inside Richter's root cellar, a small, steady fire in a modest iron stove was enough to keep the single large room comfortably warm. Anka found she needed less wool for her knitting, and the children, Elias and Lena, played on the floor in their shirt sleeves, a sight unheard of in other cabins where the floors were always rivers of cold air. Then, on the 3rd of January, 1884, the world changed. A low, gray sky pressed down on the plains, and the wind, which had been a constant companion, fell eerily silent. The old-timers knew the sign. It was the deep breath before the scream. The great blizzard arrived not with a roar, but with a sinister, quiet intensity. The temperature began to plummet. By nightfall, it was minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By the next morning, minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. And the wind had returned, a physical wall of moving air, picking up the fallen snow and turning the world into a churning, white chaos. For the next 3 days, the sun would not be seen again. The narrative splits here, cross-cutting between two households, two philosophies of survival, separated by only a few hundred yards of blinding snow, but a world apart in design. Inside Thomas Miller's cabin, a fine, well-built structure by any conventional measure, the storm was an invading army. The wind, howling at over 60 miles per hour, slammed against the north-facing wall. It found every tiny crack, every microscopic gap in the chinking, and forced its way in as needle-sharp drafts. The temperature outside was now minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill made it feel like minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Miller's family, his wife Sarah, and their 2 young sons were huddled together on the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The massive stone fireplace, a source of pride for Miller, was consuming wood at a terrifying rate. A full cord of pine, which should have lasted a week, was half gone in a single day. The heat roared up the chimney, and with it, all the warm air in the cabin. The fire was a ravenous beast, and the house was its cage. The far corners of the room were already below freezing. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the fire developed a skin of ice. Inside Klaus Richter's earth-sheltered home, the storm was a distant rumor. The only sound was a low hum, the vibration of the wind passing over the sod roof high above. There were no drafts, not one. The air was still and calm. The small iron stove glowed with a gentle, steady heat, fed by a single log every few hours. Anka sat in her rocking chair, knitting, a kerosene lamp casting a warm, golden light on the room. Elias was meticulously finishing his small wooden bird, while Lena slept peacefully in her small bed, covered by a single quilt. Klaus checked the thermometer he had hung on the wall. It read 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference wasn't marginal. It was a chasm. His neighbors were in a desperate fight for survival. His family was simply at home. On the second day, the situation in the Miller cabin grew dire. The woodpile, which had seemed a mountain of security in the fall, was now a small, sad mound. The cold was winning. It had claimed the entire cabin except for a small 6-foot circle around the fire. Sarah's face was pale with fear, her hands trembling as she tried to warm them. Thomas Miller, the confident builder, the man who had advised and judged his neighbors, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the dread of failure. He had built a beautiful trap. His gaze fell upon the heirloom cradle stored in the corner. He had crafted it from clear pine for his firstborn son 16 years ago. It was a piece of his heart, a symbol of his skill and his love. Now it was just dry wood. With a look of profound defeat, he took his axe and with 3 sharp blows shattered the cradle into pieces. He fed the smooth, hand-carved rockers to the ravenous fire, the smoke carrying away a memory of his younger, more hopeful self. The act bought them another hour of warmth. It was a trade he would never forget. The crisis came on the 3rd day. A loud crack echoed through the Miller cabin. A fissure had appeared in the chimney stone, a result of the extreme, continuous heat. Smoke began to leak into the room. It was now not only dangerously cold, but dangerously toxic. Miller knew he had no choice. They could not stay. To remain was to risk freezing or suffocating. His pride, his certainty, his entire worldview had been shattered by 3 days of relentless cold. There was only one place to go. Bundling his family in every remaining scrap of wool and canvas, he opened the door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it back against the wall. The world outside was an apocalypse of white. He tethered his family together with a rope and began the 100-yard walk to Richter's root cellar. Each step was a battle. The wind stole his breath, and the cold was a physical pain. He could barely see the low-slung roof of Klaus's home, a dark shape nearly swallowed by the drifts. He hammered on the thick wooden door. When it swung open, the sensation was so jarring it felt like a hallucination. It was not a blast of heat, like from a furnace. It was a wave of silent, profound, enveloping warmth. It was the feeling of stepping from the deck of a storm-tossed ship into a quiet, calm harbor. The air didn't move. He saw Anka Richter, her face calm, ushering his shivering family inside. He saw the children on the floor, looking up from their play, their faces rosy and warm. And then he saw it, the proof device that broke the last of his resistance. Against the far wall, a full 20 feet from the small stove, sat a wooden bucket of water. There was not a skim of ice on it. It was perfectly, impossibly liquid. He thought of his own bucket, a solid block of ice just 6 feet from his raging fire. He stumbled inside, pulling off his frozen hat and gloves. The snow on his coat began to melt instantly, puddling on the dry wooden floor. He looked at Klaus, who was simply watching him with a quiet, non-judgmental patience. Miller was a man of measurements and facts. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat and pulled out his own small brass-cased thermometer, an instrument he trusted implicitly. He held it in the center of the room, his hand shaking from cold and exhaustion. He watched as the mercury, which had been huddled at the bottom of the tube at -35 degrees Fahrenheit, began a steady, determined climb. It passed 0. It passed 32. It passed 60. It came to rest on 67 degrees. He looked at the number, then looked again, as if the instrument might be lying. But it was his thermometer. It was his truth. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and cracked. "I brought my thermometer," he said, looking Klaus Richter in the eye. "I measured twice." The admission hung in the warm, still air. It was more than a statement about the temperature. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was the complete surrender of a lifetime of certainty to a single, undeniable fact. The Miller family sheltered with the Richters for the final day of the blizzard. For Thomas Miller, those 24 hours were a profound education. He was a craftsman, and he saw with a craftsman's eye. He ran his hand along the interior stone wall, the one flush against the earth. It was not cold. It radiated a faint, deep-seated warmth, like a sun-baked rock long after sunset. He watched Klaus feed the stove, noting the small size of the logs, the infrequent need for fuel. He observed the complete and total absence of drafts, a condition he had never before experienced in a Wyoming winter cabin. It was a sanctuary of stillness. He spoke little, but his mind was working furiously, deconstructing his own beliefs and rebuilding them around this new, earth-shattering reality. He was not just a guest seeking shelter, he was an apprentice, humbled before a master. When the storm finally broke, the world was a transformed place. The sun shone on a landscape of immense, sculpted drifts, and a profound silence had fallen. When the community began to emerge, the accounting began. Livestock losses were heavy. Several outlying cabins had suffered cracked chimneys or had simply run out of wood, their inhabitants forced to shelter with neighbors. The blizzard had been a brutal, impartial inspector, testing every structure and every assumption. A week later, at the general store, the mood was somber. The men gathered, sharing stories of the siege, their voices hushed with the memory of the cold. Jeb Stone, in an attempt to lighten the mood, started to fall back on an old joke. "Well, I wonder how old Klaus made out in his—" he began, but the words died in his throat. Thomas Miller, who had been standing silently by the counter, turned to face the room. His face was grim, his authority absolute. "Jeb, be quiet." The room fell silent. Every man there respected Thomas Miller. His word on matters of building was law. "I was wrong," Miller said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the store. "What Klaus Richter built, it's not a cellar. It's the warmest, most solid house in this entire territory." He let that sink in. "I spent the last night of the storm there. My family and I, my cabin, the one I built with my own hands, was 38 degrees and filling with smoke. His was 68 degrees, on half the wood." He paused, looking from face to face, ensuring they understood the magnitude of what he was saying. "We've all been fools, laughing at the one man who knew how to talk to the land instead of just yelling at it. He didn't fight the winter. He asked the earth for help." The validation was total and public. The mockery died in that moment, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning respect. The nickname Richter's Root Cellar was never spoken again, except in tones of awe. It was now the Richter House, and soon, the Richter Method. That spring, 3 families planning to build new homesteads approached Klaus, not with skepticism, but with humility, asking for his guidance. The first among them was Thomas Miller. He didn't tear his own cabin down. Instead, with Klaus's advice, he began the back-breaking work of digging a deep, stone-lined cellar directly beneath it, planning to integrate it into his existing home to tap into the geothermal stability he now understood. He was retrofitting his own failure with another man's wisdom. Over the next decade, the sight of a low-slung, earth-bermed, sod-roofed house became more common, across the Powder River Basin. The Richter method, adapted and modified, became a new vernacular for those who understood that survival on the plains was not about dominance, but about intelligence. It was a quiet revolution, spreading not through books or government manuals, but through the lived experience of a warm, safe winter. Klaus Richter's innovation was, in truth, a rediscovery of ancient knowledge. For thousands of years, humans had understood the insulating power of the earth. But in the rush of westward expansion, with its focus on timber and rapid construction, that wisdom had been left behind. Klaus, by bringing his old-world masonry skills to the new-world problem of the prairie winter, had bridged that gap. He had built a structure that anticipated the principles of modern passive house and earth-sheltered design by nearly a century. He had proven that the most effective technology is often the one that works in harmony with nature, not in opposition to it. The great struggle on the frontier was often framed as man versus nature, a battle against the elements. But the deepest lesson of the Richter house was a philosophical one. The earth was never the enemy. The wind and the cold were not malicious forces to be conquered, but predictable physical phenomena to be understood and accommodated. The settlers who saw the ground as something merely to be built upon missed its greatest gift. Klaus Richter saw it as a partner, a vast and generous shelter waiting to be embraced. He didn't rise above the challenges of the frontier. He nestled his family into the heart of its most steadfast solution. The harshest frontiers don't reward the man who fights the world, but the one who understands it. The deepest wisdom isn't always found on the highest mountain. Sometimes it's buried just beneath your feet. If this story changed the way you look at a simple patch of ground, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more stories of forgotten genius. Let us know in the comments the coldest winter you've ever experienced. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. Chiang's disclaimer. This story is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by historical, earth-sheltered building techniques. The characters and specific events are created for dramatic purposes, but the engineering and thermal principles are real. Always consult with modern building codes and professional engineers before attempting any construction.